So once again, go to October daily participation and click on resubmit, and the text box will open up. And just need to type 3 significant points. And today we'll look at major legislation that Congress has passed. And two of the first pieces had to do with setting up the country both geographically and structurally when it comes to the government. The Northwest Territories were actually established by the Continental Congress, but then that legislation continued and set precedent whenever the new republic was set up under our second government with the Constitution. And this basically set a system up so that the federal government was continually getting land, in some ways conquering, taking, or purchasing, and then redistributing it to landowners, to private entities that could purchase it and then move westward. So that way we were encouraging the frontier to expand and distribute the population so weren't all packed onto the East Coast, using up all the resources there. And so the Northwest Territories Act continued to be the whole way through the 19th century precedent setting. Then the Judiciary Act was the other one, and this set up the judicial branch. The legislative and executive branches are mostly established, except for the cabinet offices, in Articles 1 and 2. And so Article 3 basically just says Congress will make the judicial branches needed, except that there's definitely a Supreme Court and then inferior courts, which they don't go into detail about. So the Judiciary Act in 1789 helped set up the court system. And of course, it's obviously been modified every so often since then, but it set up the system of different levels of a hierarchy in the judicial branch, although obviously it would be tampered with when it comes to the details later on. The next set of legislation, major legislation I would mention, would be those involving slavery. A lot of compromises were made over slavery in the Constitution and then in legislation later passed by Congress. As the country expanded, there would be political competition between states that were slave owning and states that were free, particularly in the Senate, because each of them gets 2 votes. And so often it was concerned about whether or not there was a balance between the 2 groups, so that way fighting didn't break out. And so when Missouri wanted to come into the Union, it was a slave state, and it would give the slave states an extra advantage in the Senate of 2 votes. And so a compromise was made that would also bring in the state of Maine as a free state. And then they decided to divide the country along the border of Missouri, along 36 degrees, 30 minutes north. So that way, everything north of that from now on would be free, and everything south of that would be slave. And they said, this solves everything, and we'll all be able to go about our lives peacefully, except for slaves. So years would go by, and eventually a new state would want to come into the Union, California. And as you know, geographically, it stretches along the West Coast, and it goes on both sides of that line. And so that created a new problem. And so another compromise would have to be made with the Compromise of 1850. It did allow California to come into the Union, but it also made some trading for other things that the South maybe wanted as an advantage. For instance, the Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northerners, especially government officials, to help capture runaway slaves. So this was a compromise that both sides got something they wanted, but obviously something like that was incredibly controversial and probably actually made the Northerners angrier about slavery than before. And then the last piece was considered the most brilliant compromise, but actually made things a lot worse, would be the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And it said basically when these 2 territories decided to become states, they would get to vote on whether or not they would have slaves. Well, that sounded simple, but what it did is it created this race for both sides to try to send as many people as possible, especially to Kansas, so that way they could outvote the other side. And all it ended up doing was creating fighting between the 2 groups. There'd be a town of people that supported slavery and a town of people that supported abolition, and they would sometimes get into fights. There would be rioting and murder that would happen because of it. So it was pretty drastic. In fact, both groups claimed that they were the electoral victors, and both sides would write their own constitution for the state, and it ended up being a disaster known as Bloody Kansas. So once again, it actually helped increase tension instead of decreasing. After the Civil War, the Homestead Act was another piece of legislation like involving the Northwest Territories, except this encouraged people to continue to move westward, giving them plots of land that they could then farm, for instance. And it did help encourage a lot of people to move westward, especially newer immigrant groups from Northern and then eventually Eastern Europe, which is why you can sometimes find these types of communities spread throughout the Midwest. Probably one of the most terrible pieces of legislation, which it didn't necessarily start America's xenophobia or fear of foreigners, but the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, which obviously targets Chinese people in particular. And this would be one of the forms of legislation that would extremely limit immigration and target specific groups of people. The funny thing about it was, not so funny actually, but there really was hardly any Chinese people in the United States. But for some odd reason, they felt the need to pass this. Then there's the regulation laws. Two of them in particular, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which of course outlaws monopolies and allows the government the ability to go after those companies and break them up to encourage competition. And then also passed during the Progressive Era would be the Food and Drug Act, which started the government's ability to inspect consumer goods, especially if there's an enormous health risk that could destroy the economy, like, for instance, involving food and drugs. Because if either of these are contaminated or poisonous in any way, it could end up killing a lot of people, causing a panic and causing a downturn in the economy. And so the Food and Drug Act was passed. And if we move on to probably one of the greatest legislative times in American history would be during the New Deal, during the Great Depression. And probably the pinnacle of all of those pieces of legislation was the Social Security Act, which obviously sets up the supplementary income that you received. For everybody in this room, it would be after we turn 67 because the age has gone up a little bit, obviously, because we're living longer. No? You don't think we'll get it? It's easy to solve. Not politically, but it's easy to solve. All that they have to do is raise the cap on taxes, because you only pay Social Security tax up to like $200,000 or $300,000, and then after that, you don't pay anything. So if they got rid of that cap, they continue to expand the age, because obviously all of us probably could work till we're 70, because it doesn't really make a lot of sense to work for 40 years and then be retired for 30, because you're basically living off all that money that you only work 10 more years than what you'll be retired. So they do need to expand the age a little bit more, and they could also, there's some other things that they could do too in order to make sure that that works. But unfortunately, older people don't like talking about it because they're afraid it's going to disappear, and they vote more than anybody else. And Democrats don't like the idea of decreasing benefits, which would include raising the age, and Republicans don't like raising taxes. So that's why it hasn't happened. But nothing, of course, motivates politicians than a dangerous moment. So if Social Security goes to collapse, you can be sure that they'll push through the necessary reforms to do that. But anyway, the Social Security Act also includes something that was passed in the 60s later on when it was amended to include Medicare, which provides healthcare coverage for elderly people as well. So Medicare is specifically for the elderly, and that was included in the Social Security Act later. And then after that, two pieces of legislation that have tried to help repair some of the damage of discrimination in the past. In the 60s, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act basically tried its best to outlaw discrimination in public places, of course, because the federal government only has power over interstate commerce. If it's a small, isolated business, there's not a lot they can do about that. And the Voting Rights Act tried to help protect African Americans, especially in the South and some segregated cities in the North, to make sure that they are guaranteed to be able to get the right to vote. And the last one I want to mention is that Congress should, if it's doing its job, always go back and revisit these pieces of legislation, like the Social Security Act, go back and change it later on, or pass a new law like the Homestead Act to improve upon the Northwest Territories Act. In the 90s, they passed something that we commonly call welfare to work, which took the welfare programs that grew under the Great Society under Lyndon Baines Johnson and added some stipulations that it has to be cut off after a period of time, and that while you're using it, if you're able-bodied, of course you're not disabled, you have to be able to at least work a certain number of hours. And if there's a lack of jobs or job training, then you at least have to perform community service or some other type of activity. And so a lot of the common myths about welfare were from before when this was passed. People stay on it forever, they don't have to work. Those things actually haven't been true since the 90s, thanks to this particular piece of legislation. So make sure you type in those three things.